Well, good evening, everyone, to the Raymore City Council work session for Monday, December the 5th, 2022. We only have one item on our work session agenda this evening, one official item, and that is Universal Design Housing. Thank you for your patience. I know we were supposed to have it on our last work session, but had to pull it off there. We were minus a couple of folks that evening. Wanted to make sure the full council had an opportunity to discuss this this evening. I'll turn it over to staff for a report.
Thank you, sir. And I will immediately turn it over to Mr. Gress, who will be making the report on this evening. He's done a lot of research on it.
Thank you, sir. And thank you to the council for entertaining this discussion. We're here tonight, Mr. Eppert and I, excited to recap with the council a little bit of what we've done in the past around universal design and residential construction, and then talk through some options of where potentially the city could go next with a kind of a long-term approach to that. So the council can remember back to 2018, we actually discussed, that was our last meeting on universal design. That was when the council approved our universal design pilot project that we worked on. The home ended up being in Knoll Creek subdivision. We partnered with Pinnacle Homes of Kansas City on that project, and we'll recap that here in just a second. But before we get started, I wanted to just recap with the council what is universal design and why would we be focusing on it. So if up on the screen you'll see just in general the 7 principles of universal design. All boils down to ensuring that anybody, regardless of their age or ability, can utilize something, whether it's housing or commercial design, but it's designing that product or that item with equity in mind, that anybody with any physical disability or ability can utilize that product without a significant detriment to their ability to use it. Why universal design? Why should we be talking about that? Staff recognizes the importance of this topic, particularly due to the council can think back to when our Community for All Ages plan was adopted in 2018. That is where a bulk of our work around this topic really commenced. Some of those other items related to housing, but universal design was a primary focus of that plan, and the plan recognizes the need for the city to formally adopt a universal design policy, whatever that might look like in its final form. I wanted to highlight here, this was the case the last time we talked to you all back in 2018, but it's still true today. Raymore continues to be of the top growing communities in terms of residential construction activity. And we highlight that because studies show, which I'll touch on here in just a moment, it's much more affordable and easy to accommodate some of these items on the front end of construction when you're building a home, as opposed to 20 or 30 or even 5 years later when somebody might need to be thinking about these things, trying to retrofit a home. And so a lot of that was showcased in our pilot project, and some of the things that a lot of these items are already put into a home when you're building it, things like light switches and outlets. It's just a matter of thinking about where those are placed that can be a little more widely used as you continue to age in that home. Again, I highlighted on the cost savings, and so I wanted to pause here and kind of frame our discussion a little bit moving forward. One thing to think about is there's more or less a spectrum of universal design, and I'll cover that in a future slide here, but it deals with the different scopes of work that could be required depending on what you might be trying to do in your home. If you're an older adult, you might be just trying to look for wider hallways or a chair lift or something like that to get you up and down the stairs. If you have a family member that has a severe disability, you might be looking at a totally different set of things within the home. And those things come at a much different price point, if you will. And again, incorporating those things on the front end of construction, which is generally $500 to $10,000, depending on the scope. A lot easier to plan for that when you're designing your home as opposed to $25,000 or more, again, depending on what it is you're trying to retrofit into your house. Most home plans nowadays are pretty easily adaptable to accommodate pretty simplistic things like wider hallways, different types of cabinetry and things like that. But again, if your circumstances are much more severe, it may be a little bit more difficult to plan for some of that on the front end of home construction. So just to highlight some of the things that we're talking about, again, a lot of what we'll discuss in this and the next slide are pretty simplistic things. So light switches, doorknobs, types of lighting, wider doorways, the space around the different fixtures in your home, zero-inch households. A lot of that stuff can be thought of and accommodated again, early on in the construction process. Things like zero entry doorways and thresholds are a little bit more difficult to come back after the fact and make a home a zero entry house if you didn't think about that on the front end. And so again, those are all very simplistic. If your needs are a little more complicated, those costs can go up quite significantly. So to recap with the council, again, in 2019 we partnered with Pinnacle Homes of Kansas City. Wade Beck was the builder of this house here in Knoll Creek. But the council agreed to waive any and all permitting fees that would have been associated with that residential construction project in exchange for a list of things that builder included in the home, a lot of which you saw on the previous slide. Throughout that process, he worked with staff to basically document that home from start to finish. And I would play the video here, but I don't have the mouse to click on it, but I can forward this link to you all if you are interested. But essentially, we created a marketing video that explained why somebody would be doing this to a home or thinking about this. In addition to that, they allowed for our different community groups, like our different MARC boards and Community for All Ages and other partner communities, to tour the home and kind of showcased all the individual things that he had done. One thing that was interesting about Mr. Beck is his attention to detail. So a lot of the things that he did, you can't see because they're behind the drywall. So things like blocking for grab bars and things like that, you don't see those once they're covered up. So it's really important to showcase how easy it is for those things to be thrown into the home. What he had said is a lot of times that's just scrap wood that you find that you're throwing away anyway. So you might as well find a better way to utilize it and make it impactful. But relative to that project, it was about $7,500 worth of fees. The interesting thing about that project that it was located in the Water District, so we worked with him on some of those fees as well to make it fair. And I'll cover what some of the other fees might be that the city might have some flexibility with in the future to support this. But again, that was a highly successful project. Mr. Eppert and I have shared that on numerous occasions with our Community for All Ages group and different groups that are involved in that. A lot of communities are thinking about this topic, and but not a lot of communities are doing something like the pilot project to kind of figure out what is impactful. So I commend the council for having the vision to support that pilot project here back in 2018. Actually, it does look like it will play. You can turn it up or not. Some of the things that were included in this home that you can see in this video would be the kitchen cabinets there. The majority of those are designed with what are called, I think, breakaway cabinets or knockdown cabinets. So if a wheelchair is ever needed to be accommodated in the homes, the bottom portion of the sink can be knocked out so that your chair can roll under it. I believe all the countertops are a few inches lower that would accommodate somebody in a wheelchair. The shower is a zero-entry shower that was designed specifically with somebody with a disability having to enter that shower and use it. Zero-entry home, this was a very unique lot that allowed the zero-entry to be done very easily. Not every neighborhood is like that, where a zero-entry could be a little bit more of a difficulty with different subdivision grades and things like that. So that was just a quick recap of that. I'm happy to answer any specific questions about that home. But the topic for tonight, to kind of get some feedback on, is what should the city be doing next to either continue to support something like that, or should we be thinking about it a little bit differently to encourage this type of construction and these types of elements in our new residential construction. As I mentioned, there's not very many cities that are working on kind of programs like this. There's a lot of cities that are interested in it, so we're excited that Raymore's I guess on the leading edge of that a little bit. We did look, Roland Park is one of the only cities in the metro that has adopted an ordinance, and an example of that was included in your packet for this evening. Excelsior Springs has also recently started work on a very similar program to what Roland Park has adopted. And then Sarasota County, Florida is an example that we looked at here several years ago, as they were one of the first cities in the United States to adopt something like this. Their specific program doesn't offer any financial incentives, but it does provide a checklist of what builders can do to get basically a very expedited permitting review process. So there's no fees or anything that are like waived as part of that. There's no financial incentive to gain. And in talking to an individual from Sarasota County here a couple years ago, they were struggling at the time to get people to take advantage of that. In some cases, quick permitting is a benefit. In some cases, it really doesn't move the needle for some builders. So I think it just depends on where Sarasota County would intend to go. But the checklist that they provided did provide a lot of good examples of what the city of Raymore might consider looking at as part of a similar program. There's a couple different options that we kind of put our heads together for discussion, and it's how you would go about potentially incentivizing this and making it worth it to builders to start incorporating some of these things into a project. The first one would be just a quota-based approach. So within a subdivision, should the city require that a certain percentage of those lots in the subdivision be universal design? And in that token, what does universal design mean in that example? As I mentioned, what somebody needs in a universal design home is probably different than what the next person needs. So there may be some difficulties with kind of a blanket approach like that. Or you would end up with some of the more simplistic elements like designing something to be zero entry, or something as simple as the switches in the home, some of those more simple elements. The other option would be kind of a case-by-case incentivized approach where we would work with individual builders or an individual resident that might be looking to build a home. And then based on what they might specifically be needing in their home, we would work with them on that list to create a more customized approach to that project. The other example would be kind of a hybrid. Is there a way that we can ensure that certain percentage of homes within a subdivision have a very simple list of things that are beneficial, in addition to a more tailored approach to maybe a specific homeowner in that subdivision that might need something a little bit more. I wanted to throw this up here for discussion purposes as well. I touched on this in the beginning. This touches on the spectrum that I mentioned earlier. So at the very left-hand side, you'll see accessible. When you hear that, think of the bare minimum. So like ADA standards and what's required by those types of codes. Visitable, think of what you would want in your home if you had somebody with a disability come in to visit your house. If your parents or your grandparents are in a wheelchair, how would you design your house so that they can visit? You yourself might not need to take advantage of all those things in your home, but somebody that visits your home often might. And then universal is kind of the opposite end of that, where everything in the home to the greatest extent possible has been thought about through the lens of universal design. And I put this slide up there for discussion purposes because this kind of goes back to if the city looks to incentivize something for a developer to make this happen, we want to make sure that it's something that's meaningful and has a true impact for that project. As I mentioned, what is required to make a home accessible is a lot less expensive than what's required to make a home truly universal. And so we have to think about what are those costs, what are the fees that the city would collect on a project like that, and what do we have left to kind of work with to make those projects feasible from an incentive standpoint. And so what I included in front of you all this evening is kind of a sample ordinance that has different criteria for principles and things that could be included in a home. But we were looking for a little bit of feedback from the council and discussion tonight on what you all would envision being a meaningful program, or something that would accomplish the goals of that Community for All Ages master plan. So to close, some of the things to consider, what would be the minimum items that the council would like to see, whether that's accessible entries into a home, so zero entry homes, or is it something that's a little more in depth with some of the other details that I discussed tonight. Again, there are very simple things like wider doorways, internal blocking, placement of light switches. But again, we want to be sure that if we're putting the effort into this, that it's something that's going to have a true impact for the council, or for the building community, and see a true success for this program. So that will conclude my staff report and presentation. Me and Mr. Eppert are happy to answer any questions that the council has.
Okay, thank you, David. Before we get into further discussion, I'll turn it over to Mr. Fearborn.
I've asked Mr. Murdoch tonight, as Mr. Gress indicated, there are certain easy thresholds that can be met, and then there are, to get to a truly universal design standard, individual homeowners may have other requirements that they have. For those of you who don't know, Mr. Murdoch does have one of his sons who is in a wheelchair. And so I've asked him if he would mind kind of describing when he's out there building a house, the things that he has to look for and what that truly universal design really means from a firsthand standpoint, I thought it might be valuable for the council to hear that.
Appreciate that. So we did build a house in New Longview specific to make it fully accessible, everything that he would be able to reach. And I think some of the things that we tend to forget about, zero entry houses are great. They work wonderfully, but a lot of times we end up with zero entry homes that are front door, zero entry, and then you have a 6-inch lip going out onto a deck or a patio. Or you have areas going and surrounding the home that somebody will never be able to get to, whether it be a deck down to a patio, garage out to some of those different areas, those kinds of things that you need to think about. Additionally, you know, a lot of times we talk about putting the wood in for grab bars. A lot of those designs sometimes won't account for that, meaning that it doesn't end up getting drawn in there. So if it's not marked on a plan that it's there, nobody's ever going to know that it is actually there. So when you think about trying to resell a home, it's really important that whatever we essentially say we want to do with this particular ordinance or policy or whatever, you need to make sure that those drawings are updated and required. Some of the things that in terms of universal design, and David hit on it, you know, is that you really have to make sure that everything is actually usable. And so a lot of times, you know, you think about, well, you lowered something, that's great. Did you actually look at the faucet of the sink and how far it's set back from the lowered counter? Because it doesn't make any difference if you can't reach all the way across the sink to even turn it on. And so some of those things you end up realizing as you're going through the process, you need to completely redo it. That happened, right? So, you know, I mean, we ended up, we had to take 3 tries at that one to get that one done. In our case, obviously, with a child, you have to account for growth. So the lower counter for a 4-year-old in a wheelchair is significantly different than a lower counter for a 12-year-old and an adult wheelchair. You know, his wheelchair has grown, obviously, as he has grown. Wheel radiuses, height, all that kind of stuff changes. Do you have the capability and flexibility to alter those things as they get bigger? That's something else to consider. Heaviness of items becomes really huge. And that would be for older populations as well, too, by the way. That this is where kids and our older folks tend to fall into the exact same category. How heavy are some of the things that you're going to put in, whether it be doors, those kinds of things, closets with handles that pull down so you can use both levels of closets, but that requires a lot of strength and it requires extra support to be able to actually hang even the most basic things in terms of clothes. Islands in the kitchen are a particularly interesting thing because a lot of times they're very close to an oven. And can a wheelchair actually get from when the oven door is down and get behind it to actually even get into it? Sometimes you don't end up with nearly enough clearance. One of the things that we've also encountered is pantries. How do you structure shelving? That's true, by the way, through the entire house, not necessarily even a pantry, but for anybody who has accessibility concerns, trying to reach into things. Think about when you go to the grocery store, can somebody in a wheelchair reach the 3rd and 4th levels of the shelves? No, they can't. And so you do have to kind of consider some of those options as well. Carpeting versus hardwood flooring versus tile, all those things come into play. Carpet is hard to push on, as you might expect. Hardwood floors are great, except you end up with some skid marks on them if they're going really fast. So you do have to consider some of those options as well. All that to say, you know, we went through a very long and extensive process that I think is pretty applicable not only to our situation, but to many people's situations when they're trying to design a home like this. And so if you have specific questions, I'm happy to answer those because there's a lot involved in it to truly make it usable. And that would be that's my personal opinion, sir, is that when you guys are considering this, really consider, will the people be able to use it? You know, not just what will look nice, what will get us an award, can they use it?
Mr. Murdoch, if you could share with us just an approximate, when we go from that basic level usable to, say, something that has to be customized to your extent, what
Yeah.
were you seeing as far as dollars were concerned?
Yeah, and I should have hit on that because we talked about that in our staff meeting. Two different things associated with this is that you can anticipate an increase in the home cost somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 20 to 35%. In whatever the home is going to cost to put things in. And the reason that that happens is typically many homes in this realm, ours included, end up with a stair lift or an elevator within them. We went the route of the elevator. Two reasons. One is that it adds value to your home in the long run, whereas a stair lift is notorious for lowering the value of a home because it takes up some of the stairwell, hurts the wall if you ever try to take it out, that kind of thing. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 35% is probably what we added to the cost of our home. The other thing, and I mentioned this in our staff meeting as well, some of these items do not get folded into a home loan. Mortgages will not allow them to get covered. The elevator is one of them. So people with less resources would struggle in that realm because we had to front that to be able to put it in. And as you might expect, those are not cheap, unfortunately. And so in many cases, some of these items that you think, at least our family would consider them an absolute necessity, for a home to get there, they aren't covered. And so you end up paying for a lot of the things out of pocket to start with, and then you have your basic home loan after that. So I would just make sure people understand that as well as you go through this process.
Okay. Anything else? Yep. Just open it up for discussion now. Okay. Mr. Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciate your points of entry, clarifying points, Mr. Murdock. I did have a quick question, a couple of them, but I want to start with your last point on the additional cost increase with a particular home of this style and design. With the unified, two different things, universal design home, as if those elements are the starting point, is that the same 30%, 20-30% increased, or is that somewhat reduced a little bit?
I would think it would probably be reduced a little bit. I'm speaking especially for the homes that have to put in a specialized piece of equipment, such as an elevator or stair lift. If you didn't need those two items, you would have a significant reduction in cost. But elevators and stair lifts now are $20,000 or above.
Understood. Okay, excellent. And then another point that you had brought out with regard to the resaleability, if we did whatever the council did determine was an appropriate method to move forward, whether it be a percentage of homes or incentivizing of some aspect, how is the property memorialized that it is a universal design unit? Because you buy a home, it comes with all the owner's manuals, but as those things get tossed out, what does the owner or the realtor know that this is a universal design home that they can market that way?
So I'll give the example of what they do in Sarasota County. As I mentioned, that's more of a recognition program. So they submit to that county, building office what it is that they're going to do relative to that program. If they check the boxes of what is required, they actually end up with either a placard or a sticker that they put on the home. But that's one of the things that we discussed, is that with the example of what we did here with our pilot project, that was just a speculative home. There was no buyer when they started that process. And unfortunately, well, depending on how you look at it, the person that bought that home didn't necessarily need all of the things right then there that were part of that. So they weren't seeking out a home that was universal design. So it didn't necessarily necessitate the need to go over all those things like you're kind of asking about. What I would envision, I think, if we were to move forward with a program like this, we would want to keep track of the homes in that subdivision that had some level of those elements in it, because we would need to verify that to make sure that they're following the policy that's in place. But part of that is just the stewardship of the program and continuing to use that as a tool moving forward. So part of that would be staff making sure, as one of you mentioned, that the drawings that are submitted are accurate and correct at the end of that project, so that we do maintain the record. If somebody asked where was the blocking in this home, we know it was a home that took advantage of this program, that we have those records on file, and they're not lost somewhere that we don't have them.
Excellent. I appreciate that, because one of the notes I took down, that would seem to me to be a very significant selling point, as we continue to be referred to as a bedroom community, even though we have considered a hybrid. But as our community's aging in place, and if we have maturing residents who relocate to here and they happen to upon a home that has those attributes in it, I think that would be a value add to the potential buyer of that home, that it already has those bones there that they just kind of have to bang out some sheetrock, put some things in place that would make it more appealing to them. Because I'm experiencing that now myself. You know, when we bought our home many years ago, it was already, built. We're the second owner of the home 5 years in, and now my mom can only enjoy the first floor of the home, not realizing that our parents age and there's going to be that necessity. But having a program of this nature, but some form or fashion memorializing that these are the attributes in the home, so that whoever comes next knows that those things are there that will help them and their family stay in the home, but with less additional cost to make it livable for their stage in life.
I had actually written down, as Mr. Gross was talking, I think it would be important for that particular piece of property to have the infamous and always requested as-builts on a home like that. So if there is something behind the wall, we actually have the plans for those on file here to prove up that it actually met those requirements.
One of the things that I found in my research relative to planning for but being able to retrofit a home. So your example of a parent who can't utilize the lower or upper levels of a home. There was I can't think of the city that did it, but as long as you can prove that like your family room can be converted into a bedroom if you ever had to go that route, part of that would be keeping the home plans on file so they know where and how that room could be retrofitted for a bedroom if it had to be. So some of the stuff that we did with that first project were things that, like I mentioned, they already get put into a house. We just helped them think about how they would do it through this universal design lens. Part of that would be I may not need that family room to be a bedroom today, but I may in 10 years. And if I do, can I go back to the city and get those plans that they have on file, or do I have to hire an architect that will redesign my entire house, or at least the first floor to accommodate that?
Mr. Barber?
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. Very interesting. You guys did a great job, Mr. Murdoch. My question, you talked about you couldn't finance or couldn't get a mortgage on your elevator, but once you built the house, when you go to sell it, you said it raised the value. So then the second person, you don't finance parts of a home, so they can finance the whole home. Is that correct?
That's correct. Once it's actually in there, the entire home would be able to be financed. Yep.
That seems horribly unfair, but I can understand it. And then the other question I have for Mr. Gress, do we have developers, builders coming to us requesting this? I know we have a few of, universal homes are being built in our, right now. I know people that have had parents that came back and they built some homes. Bremerton, I know there's one, zero entry. A friend of mine, mom and dad built that house. So it's being done right now, is that correct? Kind of on a custom level?
I would say on a case-by-case basis, correct. And I would say these homes incorporate different elements of universal design. I don't know of any other than the pilot project that would be a true universal design home, but they kind of pick and choose the elements that are important to them. I have seen those requests come through our office before.
And one of the questions you had was whether we should make it like a subdevelopment, have a percentage of universal homes. I think I would be against that, because not all developments are that type of home. Can you guys hear that? It's in my hearing aids. I have it on. Apologize. I had it on silent. Technology. But there's some kind of starter neighborhoods that really wouldn't, somebody, way the split levels or tri-levels or something like that, probably wouldn't be a good case. So I didn't quite understand that. Are you thinking about that, or what's?
So staff had discussed that one. If the council members, we had a work session on PUDs and the opportunities for the council to require or ask for different things based on a zoning request. That was one example where staff felt that might be worth discussing, particularly if it were the very simple things that could be done. Like I said, if you're developing a new subdivision, it's probably very easy to design the lots to be zero entry. It's probably not as easy to design those homes to all accommodate an elevator or a chair lift or something that's more complex. What staff had discussed internally relative to that approach as well would be, we're putting together a program that's supposed to benefit the person that's going to be utilizing these things. Whereas if you're putting that requirement onto a developer for an entire subdivision, how do you ensure that the cost savings that the city's trying to generate through this program are being passed on to those individuals? It's a lot easier to track that on a case-by-case basis for somebody who's more engaged in what it is they're going to put in their home. As Mr. Murdoch mentioned, they went through 3 or 4 different iterations. A much more personal experience trying to design a home through that route versus buying a home that's already been built. So that would be a potential downfall to that approach, would be ensuring that what we're trying to save those individuals isn't necessarily getting passed on, or that just whatever the requirements would be for an approach that would kind of cast a wider net for a certain percentage of homes, that you wouldn't necessarily be able to accommodate all the things that would need to be in a universal design home, more than likely because of the impact on the saleability or who would be interested in those homes, depending on what it is that you put in them.
One follow-up. And my question, too, is I take it there's architects that specialize in this. I know Mr. Murdoch talked about having some issues and all that. Is that a resource that the city would want to have? You know, we would know some people that if you're going to do this, these folks are the ones that are experts, and not having to redo something 2 or 3 times to get it right.
There are definitely architects that specialize in this, either that or like nonprofit advocacy groups that would provide resources to an architect if they didn't know how to do this. The challenge we've had is that Raymore has a fair balance of what I guess I would call production builders that build their 5 or 6 different floor plans. They may tweak the facade of it or the downstairs or so forth, but for the most part it's the same design structurally. And then you have somebody like Pinnacle Homes who does build truly custom homes. You know, we really lucked out with Wade because he was willing to, he actually proposed a few things to us that we didn't think about with that home. So you do have folks out there that are interested in getting creative and trying to work within a program like this, but you also have those larger, like I said, more production builders that just build what it is that they build, and they're only open to customizing a few things because then it gets really costly, at which point they would pass that on to the consumer, and so then we're settled with how do we address making that affordable as part of a program like this.
And Councilman Barber, I would also, you have HOAs who can sometimes get in the way a little bit of wanting or allowing a custom home if it gets outside the scope of what the neighborhood has generally allowed. So you do have to kind of watch out for HOA comments that come in.
John?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. To Councilman Barber's point, there's some things I would agree with on that. I wouldn't want to do this to the point where we force developers to not look at our city. I certainly wouldn't want to make developers put in elevators or stair lifts. But I think there are things we could consider. Years ago, and it's been 25 years ago, I worked on a framing crew, and so I know that some of these things can be done very cheaply, like you mentioned the blocking. We've done that in the past, and it is just scrap lumber that you're putting up. It's a little bit of labor, but some of the things that we could do on a very, very small, maybe 1% of the homes or 2% of the homes, we could do the zero entry, like you saw in the video, for the front door and the garage and maybe the back deck, the blocking in the kitchen and the bathrooms for the towel racks and grab handles and things like that, the zero shower entry, the widened doors, if I didn't already say that. And as far as the elevator, I wouldn't want to put something like that in, but you can frame a space for that to be added in the future on a very small scale for a very small amount of money, for probably 10% of the cost of actually having to retrofit that later on down the road. So my question is, do we want to do maybe a much scaled back minimalist version of this, maybe a visitable house? Maybe 1% we could require in some of these neighborhoods. Maybe there would be some exceptions that we couldn't do if we had some split level homes and things like that, but
I think staff is looking for a direction forward to have this in place. The overarching question becomes, is it going to be a mandatory requirement, which is kind of what we've talked about here, and at the staff level when we were discussing it, Or is it going to be, we would like to incentivize them to do 1%, X number of percent, one home in each subdivision? Both of them have a little bit of a challenge in that, as Mr. Gress talked about, whether it's mandatory or an incentive program, is our ultimate goal to get them built or to have those costs pass on to the ultimate user of the home? We want to make sure that whatever is done, as Mr. Murdoch indicated, is meaningful, that it's not just on there so that we can say we're the city that's doing this, although we do like to say that. When we were bringing up the incentive program, if we are doing it just for a single home, developer comes to us, builder comes to us and says, I plan on doing a universal design home in this location. What are your minimum standards for that? And we're incentivizing them in some way to do that. How much are we interfering in a private enterprise item with either one, actually? And how much are we subsidizing a home for a particular family need that is going to move into it, and not subsidizing other homes for other family needs? I'm just throwing out questions that staff had here. With the initial statement that staff really would like to have something in place, but we want it to be fair and equitable across the board. And we're struggling with that and kind of seeking direction from the council on how you would like to see us move forward with it, and just bring all those up.
Jay?
Thank you, Your Honor. I would concur with Councilmember Berenson's general concepts as well as Councilmember Barber's. This one's going to be complex. I think this is probably going to be a living program if we develop it, and we're going to have to make changes as we go. It gets down to the weeds. This thing gets complex. Are we starting to, hey, we're going to cut off these fees, and all of a sudden all they're doing is just squeezing a little extra profit out of this? How do we get what we want out of this without just, like you said, tinkering in the fair market system and the monetary issues? If we were to use one of these, I think Councilman Barber's point is correct, and Councilman Berenson pointed to as well. I don't think it's going to work very well to just say, hey, 15% of the homes have to have this. I think probably a hybrid is more likely, something along the, we will possibly provide some incentive on fees of up to 7% of the homes or 10% of the homes. That way we don't have somebody that's just, we'll know pretty quick if it's just a money grab. And I think that's a start. I think that's high end. And when we get down into what does that look like, is it just the blocking piece, which is pretty easy and pretty cheap, up to, hey, we're going to put an elevator in here. Do you get more money for that? That remains to be seen. I kind of like the idea. I think it's worthy of exploration, certainly, and I think there's value in it, but there's some tough questions to get to a final product, certainly.
And Councilmember, one thing I would even like to contribute to that point is a lot of times builders, I think, just want the incentive to be able to customize the house, meaning, for us, we need to, even if it's the bare minimum that we can do, is make sure that this community is allowing builders who are willing to custom build to get into the areas and know that that this is an option for them, that we don't need just 5 to 7 floor plans, would make a big difference. Because quite honestly, even in Lee Summit, there were neighborhoods we could not go to because we wouldn't have been able to customize. And so I think, and I will just tell everybody, the need is out there. That's my personal thing. There's plenty of people and need out there who would be willing to do this. So,
John?
I think Jay is right. it is going to get complicated. And if we're looking for suggestions, my suggestion might be to maybe require 1%, and talk about this again in a year from now, but require 1%. And if they're building 20 homes, then we would waive that, obviously, but 1% if they're building more than 50 homes, so that we're not making a big impact on that developer. But what we're going to find when we have these developments with 400 homes, if we're requiring them to have 4 of them, a lot of these homes are built speculatively, and when the buyer comes to this developer to buy a home, you know, they're picking from floor plans and they're picking from lots. But when even if this home is under construction and not quite built, if it has the bare basics of this in here, they can then choose to do the cabinets and do the other things. But if they just have this small framework in place, I think it'd be beneficial. And I think it would, to Ryan's point, I think it would bring people to our town. I think it would make us one of the leaders in Kansas City, and it would give us, I don't know, recognition. And you know, Charlene said if we want to be a first-class city, we need to act like a first-class city. I think it's a first-class idea and something that we should talk about. And so I do support it. I think we should start very, very small and maybe dip our toe in the water and then revisit it a year from now and see if it's worked, if it hasn't worked, if we want to pull the plug, if we want to make it bigger. But that's my suggestion. Thank you.
Who's next? I had a question, kind of more directed, I guess, towards you. We're talking about the developer and the builder. What about if we did do it more to where it was the resident? If we somehow, I don't know, if you would have to tell me if there's a way to let residents know, hey, we have this to where if you can find a builder or you can go to a builder, we'll help with incentives? Or is that too, like, I don't know, whenever you're looking for a home, do you look specifically for a builder that will build what you want? Or do you have like a community, or is there somewhere out there?
I think there's two different questions. Number one is when we were looking, yes, we needed to find a neighborhood that would allow a custom build to come in, and B, who was that builder going to be? And there are certain builders, as Mr. Gress has already indicated, who specialize in that. We were very fortunate in the group that we selected. And to that end, there are also certain specialty organizations that do certain parts of it. KC Lift, for example, is one of the prime players who does all of your stair lifts and elevators and stuff like that. There's concrete companies who specialize and are better with their expertise in ramps and grade inclines and stuff like that. But the second portion of that is, this is the question all along that we have wrestled with, is I recognize that I don't necessarily want to be incentivized just as a resident coming in, because there are other people who have other issues that aren't necessarily from an accessibility thing who would also benefit from an incentives thing. What I would articulate is that we need to make it easier, I guess is the best word, for people who need these things to know that they are welcomed and can find them within a particular community. Incentivizing the builder, I think, is a great option, because you still want them to be willing to come into the community, do the project, and do a wonderful job on the project. I think that also, the craftsmanship becomes a key issue. So that's kind of where I'd land on that.
Mr. Barber.
Thank you. I got a couple of questions. One is, thinking about the elevator, do we require a permit for an elevator, and what kind of yearly inspection, or what's the whole process with the home elevator?
The city would require a permit for the elevator. We would inspect it, but after that, it really would be on the homeowner to ensure that it's maintained beyond that point.
Okay. And is that something we could look at incentivizing, saying, waiving that permit, you know, since we found out you cannot, you know, finance it in a normal mortgage to help?
I think one of the hybrid approaches that we discussed were, what are the baseline items that we want to establish as the requirement, and whether you do that for a certain percentage of homes, or you do it up to a certain percentage of a fee that you will waive. But then beyond that, for the things that are really expensive, like elevators or chair lifts, or I don't know what other specialty equipment is out there, but then do you look at adding those on to that baseline to make it, everybody can benefit from wider hallways, but not everybody is going to benefit from an elevator necessarily. So do you look at that baseline in addition to, we'll waive the permitting fee for the elevator? I don't know what the cost is for that off the top of my head. I think it would be dependent on the type of equipment, but do you tailor it to where it is unique to the extent of you're going to incentivize exactly what that family is needing? Because, like I said, not everybody's going to need or want an elevator from day one. They might want to plan for it, but they might not have the cost to install that from day one. So do you start working with the specifics of what a resident is looking for in a home and try and incentivize that piece of their construction project?
My next question is, Mr. Murdoch made a comment that there were some neighborhoods he couldn't build a home in there. Do we need to look at our PUDs when an HOA or POA is coming? Do we need to look at that and say, encourage them not to have language in there where somebody couldn't have a zero entry home?
That was, so some of the difficulties that I think we would experience in a percentage approach like that for a subdivision, would be, I guess, the monitoring of it over time. When developers come in, 400 homes is a lot, but they typically only build 20 or 30 in a subdivision phase at once. What I would envision, just depending on what that final program would look like, would be that developer would push those universal design homes to the very end of that construction project. So then we're saddled with, well, I've got these 10 lots left, can't really build the universal design home, and so we're stuck, I guess, negotiating with that is, do we hold them to that requirement, or do we give on some of those things to ensure that the home is built? The other thing would be how this program just fits into overall city code. The PUD is a good example because they're asking for something from the city in terms of a specific zoning or development standard, so setbacks or home sizes, et cetera. So in exchange for the city offering that flexibility and the requirements, we're going to require that you build 15 zero-entry homes. I'm not quite certain how that program would fit into our standard, like an R1 zoning district. The UDC establishes what those minimums are right now, so as long as those are met, we have to issue a permit for that home, more or less. So is it something that has to be restricted to a PUD that's more non-traditional, or would this be a code requirement that we could incorporate to any home in any zoning district? Like I said, in an R1 district, the developer's not asking for anything from us other than a permit to build a home, whereas with a modification to those, they're asking the council to approve something that's specific for that project. The last thing, and it was brought up in an earlier question, was how this gets passed on. One thing that I learned in talking to Excelsior Springs is that they dealt with that as well. So they don't actually waive the permit fees up front. They actually rebate those fees to the homeowner after the project is done. They wrestled with, we're going to waive $7,000 in fees, potentially. How do we know that the builder isn't going to pocket $7,000 and keep that home price the same? So they actually make the builder pay those fees up front. They hold them more or less like in an escrow account or something, and then when all that is certified that it was done, they write that check to the homeowner at the end of that, which is something we kind of discussed internally. How do we keep the developers from pocketing these cost savings, particularly when you're doing it over multiple homes in a subdivision? It's probably a lot easier to do it case by case, but from an implementation standpoint, that was really helpful to know from Excelsior Springs.
All right. I got two. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Just know there's somebody else wants to talk to.
Yes, no, it was just, this is a real quick, because I'm listening to the conversation. I'll go ahead, Mr. Holman.
Just teasing you.
I know. We're keeping it light tonight. As I'm listening to the conversation, is universal design exclusively to new build, or is the concept, do we have, from the standpoint of being equitable for existing homeowners who have a need, for something of this level, may not be as aggressive as new build because obviously existing structure, but is there opportunity there for homes that could be remodeled, that some aspect of this could be applied?
There would be. The nature of this discussion is just solidifying that it's more expensive to retrofit than it is to think of it on the front end. But I would assume that if the council, and I think it's worded in the resolution or the ordinance that we drafted up, it would apply to a retrofit. I don't know off the top of my head what that benefit would be, but the intention would be they're doing something that's relative to universal design, that we're going to use this program to incentivize it.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, I think that this is an idea with value and worth exploring. But as with anything, I'm sure you'd like to have a Lamborghini. I would want to see anything that we are tasked with that's put in front of us for consideration. I would want a hard number budget impact to us, or an estimated budget impact of anything we might be losing, what the offset would be, and how difficult that would be for us to absorb. You got to think pragmatic. And
Most certainly, sir.
Of the examples that we've looked at for ordinances, most cities only waive their building permit fee, which is one small fee in the overall what they pay for a building permit. It's usually about $200, $250. And that's what spurred our discussions on $250 in the grand scheme of a $20,000 elevator isn't going to move the needle or inspire somebody to do what they weren't going to do in the first place. When you look at whether it's a percentage of that overall fee, which would fluctuate based on what it is they're doing, or is it a set of these 4 fees the city will waive? We're still going to collect our sewer connection fees and all those other things that get lumped into that. But that's what spurred our discussion is what is that amount, and is it something that's actually beneficial to somebody that's making that investment into their home?
Sonia?
Just to add my 2 cents, it seems to me like it's going to be really hard to try to do some kind of quota thing. I mean, if you try to say you have to have this many homes, I feel like what we're going to see builders doing is just the bare minimum. And, Mr. Murdoch, if you tried to move your family into a house with just the bare minimum of these options, would that really be worth it for you? I mean, that's not helpful. And even a little beyond the bare minimum, when you're talking about families who need something so specialized, I mean, sure, it might make a house more attractive to a family like Reggie's, where, mom's struggling to get up and down the stairs and some basic mobility issues. But for families, with more severe needs, this is a drop in the bucket to what they need. So is it really going to make a difference? Is it really going to be impactful? I mean, I'm hesitant to just dip our toe into it, so to speak, if what we're going to do isn't even going to be that meaningful for very many people. It makes sense. I mean, I hear what we're saying about to retrofit is a much bigger deal, but the reality is a family who needs that probably isn't going to be able to retrofit. They're just going to have to start from scratch. But I also am very much in favor of what Mr. Murdoch suggested with saying our communities need to be more open to a wider variety of plans so that we have more options for people in town to build what they need.
I think what I'll close with in response to that would be there perhaps is an opportunity to get the best of both worlds with something like this, where from an incentive, what it is we're going to incentivize for somebody in a home may be more specific to these requirements. But I go back to the example of a PUD. The next time a PUD request appears before the council, there's nothing in city code right now that says that zero-renter homes are a priority of the community. But if there was, the council, I would assume, could always look to something like that, and we're going to approve this reduction in these development standards. We, the council, would like to see these things. It's not necessarily requiring it for every home. It would be specific to a specific project. But if there's elements of this that can be incorporated into the UDC that would be more goals or aspirations of what staff should be looking for when we're supporting those zoning requests, perhaps that's one alley that we could go down. And then specific to universal design and some of the more intricate details would be the incentive program that we could look at crafting as well.
Go ahead, Ken.
Got one more. Sorry to drag this out, but the market, building a home, is a free market. People want a home, they go to these builders and build it. And so if there's a need and for these universal homes, maybe we need to decide what we consider a universal home. Our definition, City of Raymore, this is our universal home. And then, like you said, change the wording in the HOAs, POAs, force them to do that in the PUDs so that they can't block anybody from doing it. But this is what we call a universal home. So somebody can, I don't want it to be where somebody says, well, we just put extra boards in for grab bars, and so that's our universal home. Well, no, that's not. Our definition of universal home is, I don't know if we need to go as in detailed as Sarasota County did, but something like that. These are the things that we consider a universal home, and you have to allow that in your community.
I think it's worth exploring with all subdivisions that have amenities. We do require that they establish the HOA, so I haven't spent a lot of time reading through every single HOA, but that was something that was unique to me, that even if I could afford to build it and had all the money, there's neighborhoods that I can't go into because of that. So perhaps that's something we look at as well, whether, you know, when we receive those documents from a developer, we provide them the language that we require them to put in that, you know, it's understandable why a neighborhood may not want to allow a custom build in a neighborhood for a lot of reasons, but if it's for the purposes of accommodating disabilities or universal design, there's probably language that can be crafted that would require them to allow that. I don't see our attorney shaking his head down there, so we might be onto something. But that is something that was new to me, that some neighborhoods don't even allow this. I can see it on one end of that conversation, but not for something like this that would be for the purposes of accommodating something that is very needed.
And keep in mind, by the way, on designs, sometimes you can keep the outside of the house looking exactly like you want it within the neighborhood, as long as there's an allowance to completely change the inside of it, which people don't see the majority of the time anyway. You can still stay with the theme of the neighborhood, those kinds of things. Keep all of that looking like your neighbors, because that's a lot of times what the neighbors want, but then give that allowance to completely shake up what the inside of the house might look like, where you don't have to follow some basic floor plan. That's also just something else to think about.
You know, there's been a lot of touching on it. I did ask Mr. Zur to talk to the council about fair housing standards. So, Mr. Zur.
Sure. So I'm supportive of the city wanting to find ways to assist in universal design. Absolutely would be willing and open to that concept. From the perspective of HOAs, if I'm an HOA, I have all kinds of concerns trying to limit a universal design when someone has requested that. Fair housing would, and ADA standards would allow an individual to come back in and say, I need this as an exterior entry as part of a build. I think it makes perfect sense to have staff include that in any development agreement that we might have. And if we review the declaration of covenants, conditions, and restrictions for the individual subdivision, I think it's very important to make sure that we have in there that the association can't prohibit with regard to either universal design or fair access to the properties for purposes of being able to allow that. I would not want to represent the association that came back in and said that Mr. Murdoch would not be able to make his home perfectly accessible. I have regularly provided counsel to HOAs regarding that and how to accommodate while not impacting substantially on the other aspects of the neighborhood and the continuity of design within the neighborhood. Sometimes that's front and back access points, sometimes that's rampage. All of those are things that the associations have to be concerned with getting sued for if and when they decide they want to stop that. But I do like the notion of including it as part of our review and including it in any development agreement that we might have.
I think it's universal that we want to move in that direction, so I'm asking, what next steps are you guys looking for? I know you've given us a model ordinance here. What do you want to do next?
I think baby steps. Let's get standards to the council that the council can accept or add to or modify. This is the bare minimum that we consider to be universal design on a home as a starting point. Talk that through and then work on the elements of so that Mr. Zur can defend us. When we require an HOA, we would have to have something in place after that then. Here is what we are going to require through a PUD or whatever, and whatever that standard is going to be, 1%, however that's going to look. Or are we going to incentivize somebody to come in if they do so many homes within here? Or is it going to be a bare minimum of that? Would I think be the next, what we would be asking the council to kind of be mulling over before we bring you those standards? Which one of those forks do you want to take? Incentivize or bare minimum amount as far as a percentage?
Well,
the first slide we showed, or a hybrid.
Well, that's what I was going to say, the hybrid part. Jonathan, are you good with what Excelsior Springs is doing with regard to the escrow and holding on to it till the
Absolutely.
build is done.
Absolutely.
I mean, I like that aspect of it. And that way it kind of self-polices the aspects of actual holding the builder's feet to the fire on that. Jay?
Just from the depth of the discussion, I think we kind of focused on the physical aspects, more two befores in for grab bars, that kind of thing. But it sounds like there's a lot of opportunity for us within policy. For example, things you were talking about. You want to do a PUD, here's kind of the directions we'd like to see. This is a direction. Sounds like we can do a lot of stuff in just guidance and requirements up front without actually requiring anybody. I mean, I think there's some elements to go there, but it sounds like we can do quite a bit to further our goal without actually requiring somebody to put in an elevator or even stuff for a grab bar to start, I think.
For example, within the UDC, there's, we call it a menu of options, but when developers request anything other than an R1 or an R2 zoning district, there are things like amenities or walkways or things like that that we ask them to consider. So what I would suggest would be looking at that, incorporating elements of this, and maybe finding a way, if the council wishes, to prioritize those over other things for the next couple of years, just to test it out, as opposed to requiring that any and all developments have it. It's just an option that somebody has, and the council can always say we'd rather have that than this. I think the council always has that authority to kind of pick and choose elements of a project to that regard.
Okay. Anything else you want to add?
Love this type of discussion. It's always exciting for staff and exciting to see the city be moving in a progressive direction on something like this and having this discussion. So thank you, council, for indulging us.
Anybody else have anything? Have nothing. All right. All right, well, that moves us into the next item, which is other. Does anybody have anything other they'd like to bring up this evening before we move on? If not, we're moving on. Yeah, did you have something?
Thank you, sir. Just want to remind the council that we do have only one legislative meeting in December, a week from tonight. Then we will be off on the 26th for the holiday vacation. And then the next regular meeting after that would be January 9th. To that end, we have a number of items that we will be bringing to you next week regarding landfill consultants and attorneys, and we will be asking the mayor on all three of those. You may remember I outlined for you PR firm, legal firm, consulting firm. We will bring those to you in emergency read format so that we get them on board before late January. That's all I have, sir.
No meeting on the 26th, but are we having a work session on the 19th?
We are, sir.
Okay. All right. If there's nothing else, we'll stand adjourned. Thank you all. Good discussion tonight.